Good evening. Welcome to Regent College. We are delighted to be together this beautiful evening here in Vancouver, here in the West Coast. It's so nice and sunny and warm, and we are so glad to see you here. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent and also this year's Evening Public Lecture Coordinator. Welcome to all of you who are here with us in person, and welcome to all of you who join us online anywhere around the world you may be. Welcome from Vancouver, this beautiful land where we live, work, study, and worship in the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. Tonight we have a very interesting lecture, one of the many interesting lectures and events that we continually host here at Regent. If you would like to know more about these upcoming lectures and other events and have access to other resources from Regent College, we would like to invite you to sign up for email updates. All you have to do is to pick up one of these cute little blue cards that we have all the way to the back where the donations box is. And when you do that, you have two options. The first one is on the front of the card. There is a link to Regent College where you can sign up digitally on your own. And the other option is to flip it around, and on the back there is a space where you can enter your name and your email address. And if you do that, you can just drop it by the donations box, and we will register you on our own. Either way, this is the best way to be in the know as of what's happening here at Regent. Before we start, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, we would like to invite you to put it on silent mode. Any electronic device, please put it in silent mode as we are trying to prevent any disruptions to our lecture tonight. Also, those of you who are here with us in person, please be reminded that we are live streaming and recording this lecture under the conditions spelled out in the public notice posted on the doors of Regent and this chapel room. At this point, I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Marian Kovalyshyn. She is the Associate Professor of New Testament Studies here at Regent, and she will be our host tonight. Professor Kovalyshyn, over to you.
Thank you, Pablo. Greetings and welcome to this evening's lecture at Regent College. As Pablo mentioned, I'm Mariam Kovalyshyn, and I am Associate Professor of New Testament here at Regent College. And on behalf of the community here, I want to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you here. So just to set a sense of what's going to happen, our lecturer will be speaking for about 50 to 60 minutes. And then after that, we'll have a chance for some Q&A. There's a microphone over there and one up here, I guess. And you can come to a microphone and queue if you have questions, and we would love to have a chance for some conversation. For those joining online, questions can be sent to questions@regent-college.edu. So please do send those in, and they will also be brought into the conversation. And our evening will end around 9 p.m. And after which, Dennis has agreed to be signing some books at the bookstore, so there will be a little bit of time there. So to welcome our speaker, the Reverend Dr. Dennis Edwards is Dean and VP of Church Relations at North Park Theological Seminary and former Associate Professor of New Testament there. He has 3 decades of urban pastoral ministry experience in the U.S., and his books include Humility Illuminated, A Biblical Path Back to Christian Character, and that's an excellent other book that I would recommend to you. And tonight's lecture topic is also a book, Might from the Margins, The Gospel's Power to Turn the Tables on Injustice. And he also has a commentary I would highly recommend on 1 Peter. All these books are available at our bookstore as well as in our library. I should also like to note that he is a very Regent type of person. He was also a math teacher for a long time, and he is a musician who plays both flute and saxophone. Yep. So he's very much a well-rounded Regent type person, and it's wonderful to have him at our community. This week he is teaching on 1 Peter from July 15th to 19th as part of our summer programs this year. And his lecture title tonight is Might from the Margins. With that, I welcome Dr. Dennis Edwards.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kovalicin. It's really a pleasure and privilege to be here, and thank you all. It's been a joy this week. I wore North Park University's colors, which are blue and gold, because I knew this would be recorded, and I wanted the president of the university to know I'm representing. So I got the blue and gold. So. I also want to say right away that much of what I'm saying is coming out of my own, social location as a black person in the United States. But my hope is that there would be some resonance for you folks up here in Canada and other places as well, because I think the principles sort of transcend. But I am going to refer to a lot of my own context along the way. Well, I'll get to it. 3 streams of my own life experience related to race and power and privilege came together as motivation for the book, Might from the Margins. And one stream was the work in 1 Peter. So the students some of you are here tonight, thank you for showing up. And some of the stuff that you'll hear tonight you've heard in class already, but that's okay. It'll reinforce something, right? Or you can take a quick nap during that time. So one stream was the work in 1 Peter, and in a few minutes we'll get into some of the ideas in that letter, which was written to encourage marginalized Christians in Asia Minor in the first century or so. Peter's community lacked power, prestige, and privilege, and their position in society spoke to me as I was working through that book. Another thing that influenced Might from the Margins was my pastoral experience. You heard I've been an urban pastor. I taught adjunct for a lot of years before I taught full-time. I started in church work in the 80s and during my seminary years. And it was a church on the west side of Chicago that got a lot of attention, in that this church got attention from Christianity Today, and that picture was taken. You can see the title, The Gospel in Black and White. Now, actually, Susan, my wife, who's here tonight, is in this picture in the choir. If you spend enough time, you'd see her in the upper right over there. Different hairstyle, but that's her in the picture. I was in the picture, too, on my saxophone. To the far left, you see my shoulder. So, so I did not make the cover of Christianity Today, but that's okay. The drummer actually was a fellow classmate at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School when I was working on my MDiv there. But in the 80s, there was a lot of attention given to a church that was trying to be racially diverse. Nowadays, the language maybe has changed. We were saying multiracial, multi-ethnic. We've used different kind of language in the States to talk about it, but we're talking a time not all that long ago where it seemed like a revolutionary idea to have people from different backgrounds coming to worship together. But that's where I started doing a ministry for a church, more officially, to get paid. Upon graduation, I returned to Brooklyn, New York. I'm from New York, and to plant a church. It was called New Community, a multi-ethnic church that was, I think, a bit ahead of its time because nobody seemed to come. It was hard. And now, it's what I hear about all the time, are people planting multi-ethnic churches. The story of that church, that could be a book on its own. I won't get into all of that, but I'm just telling you some of the streams that came together here. We moved then to Washington, D.C., Susan and I and our 4 children. We started a new adventure, and I started working at an overwhelmingly white church on Capitol Hill for 6 years. And I was there, I learned some hard lessons about how difficult it is for many white Christians, at least in the U.S., to have a non-white pastor. And it wasn't just about me. The church generally had difficulty including anyone who didn't fit the profile of an academically well-trained, socially well-mannered, white and middle-class suburban person, even though the church was in the heart of the city. D.C. used to have the nickname Chocolate City back then because it was an overwhelmingly black city, and yet this church, mostly white, sitting right on Capitol Hill. the church thought of itself as inclusive, but behaved in ways that marginalized a significant segment of DC's population. Now, I'm not here to denigrate any particular church or denomination or anything like that. It's not even my style, but I do want to share my experience. And I mean, one story of many was how early on in my time there, we had a meeting in the church's fellowship hall, which I don't know what you call it in your other circles, because what I've learned about koinonia is not coffee and cookies, but it's the coffee cookie hall. And we had a meeting, and it was called by young adults who were working with the youth ministry, and they had given an ultimatum that they were not going to work with the city kids, just with our kids. City kids was a euphemism for the black kids, and the our kids were the kids of the church people. So there was this sense that, oh, of course, we can't have those city kids coming and being in part of the same youth group as our kids. So I'm sitting there disturbed by this, because we have a sign outside the church that says, "A church for all peoples." That sign is still there, 30-some years later. But I was trying to say how this is problematic. Now, the meeting could have been quick if I hadn't opened my mouth, but I did, and I described how problematic that was for me. Now, I'm not going to give you the whole play-by-play of that meeting. That's not what the lecture is about. But I'm trying to say that part of my life experiences were showing me something, and then I was also trying to do all this Bible study. So this pastoral experience influenced my From the Margins as well. So my work at First Peter, my pastoral experience, and then there's a third factor, and that's my concern that many books on race and privilege, at least earlier in my life, were written to sort of center white people, to kind of make white people not feel so afraid to talk about race, or to get white people somehow to adjust. They were always the target audience, even by non-white authors. So it felt to me that the goal had always been somehow to ease the tensions of the majority culture, at least in the USA, try to get them to think and do differently, maybe to even rescue them from ignorance or judgment. So even now, after I spend a lot of time and energy in my life trying not to center white people, the main questions I tend to get after presentations is some variation of, well, what should white people do then in light of racial divisions in Christianity? So I know that that's always going to be a topic, but I was trying to say, can I talk to us on the margins and kind of appeal to some kind of solidarity of the marginalized is what I was trying to do. So in the book, I speak unapologetically as an African-American man whose people have been marginalized since we arrived on the continent. And the book has sort of as a foundation an idea like we see in 1 Corinthians. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. There's a notion right there of the power of the marginalized. Well, there's 10 chapters in the book. I'm not talking about all 10, of course. I'm going to focus on what I've been calling the power of diaspora people. The power of diaspora people is a power that comes from being marginalized. The concept of the empowerment of marginalized people reminds me of a lot of things, but one of them is a scene from the first Black Panther movie. Now, I went to see that with my staff at the church. We had a staff fun day, went to the movie, but when I went to see it with them, it was actually already my second time going to the movie. But in this scene, there is a scene that this is hinting at. I only have a picture. I'm not showing you the scene, but some of you may have seen it. Y'all watch Marvel movies up here in Canada? Just checking. All right. So anyway, there's a scene where King T'Challa is incapacitated, right? So Queen Ramonda, she comes with Lupita Nyong'o's character. She's there. They need help from the Jabari tribe. And in Baku, they want to appeal to him to get help because he's been staying out of the issues in Wakanda. And the other person in the entourage is a white agent, Agent Ross. And so when M'Baku asked for what's going on, course, Agent Ross starts to speak up right away. And if you remember the scene, M'Baku starts to bang his staff and starts to bark, and the rest of the tribe starts to bark, and they drown out Agent Ross. I was standing up in the theater because in my own experience, a man in my age group, there was so many times in my life where white people figured, oh, they knew better than I, so they would be the ones that would speak. Or I would be in a group of folks, and the immediate deference would be to the white man in the group, because of course that person has the authority and knows better. And that scene depicted a reality that the folks who put the movie together knew some of us would get that. In many contexts, the Christian faith of white people of European descent has just been a standard. The faith of marginalized people is respected only to the degree to which it affirms white superiority. But what picture of Christianity is most like that of Christ? So consider a couple of observations. The first is from Albert Rabateau, a professor of religion. He says this: African-American Christianity has continuously confronted the nation with troubling questions about American exceptionalism. Perhaps the most troubling was this: if Christ came as the suffering servant, who resembled him more, the master or the slave? Suffering slave Christianity stood as a prophetic condemnation of America's obsession with power, status, and possessions. African-American Christians perceived in American exceptionalism a dangerous tendency to turn the nation into an idol and Christianity into a clan religion. Divine election brings not preeminence, elevation, and glory, but as black Christians know all too well, humiliation, suffering, and rejection. Chosenness, as reflected in the life of Jesus, led to a cross. The lives of his disciples have been signed with that cross. To be chosen in this perspective means joining company not with the powerful and the rich, but with those who suffer, the outcast, the poor, and the despised. So Rabateau makes a good point. It's not unlike a point made by abolitionists who have been enslaved, the statesman Frederick Douglass. What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Douglass could see that the Christianity practiced by so many in America was not the way of Jesus described in the scriptures. Yet I dare say for many who would wear the title evangelical today, the great American heroes of the faith are people who justified slavery, who owned slaves themselves, and who weren't always sure what to make of the souls of black folk. Did we have souls? Could we be saved? Some of the theological giants weren't even sure. Now, I'm not going to go down that road right now, but if you want to explore more, there's a lot of places you could look. Divided by Faith is one, Color of Compromise. The Religion of Whiteness just came out. Michael Emerson, who's involved also in Divided by Faith and writing, that's a brand new recent book, subtitled How Racism Distorts Christian Faith. So my first point, after all of that I've been trying to make for these last few minutes, is that diaspora Christians are the disinherited and possess unique power to demonstrate the way of Christ. There's a unique power here. So I'm taking that word disinherited from the poet, mystic, and theologian Howard Thurman. His book, Jesus and the Disinherited, was written back in 1949, has become a classic, and many white people would do well to read the book because I didn't learn about it in seminary. It was after. Thurman centers, in his words, those whose backs are against the wall. That's his term for what I'm calling marginalized believers. There's a little bit more of where I got a few quotes, so that's why the slides, I wanted you to see them, and then maybe you would be interested in those sources. Here's a little more of what Thurman wrote. The solution which Jesus found for himself and for Israel as they faced the hostility of the Greco-Roman world becomes the word and the work of redemption for all the cast down people in every generation and in every age. The basic fact is that Christianity, as it was born in the mind of this Jewish teacher and thinker, appears as a technique of survival for the oppressed. That it became, through the intervening years, a religion of the powerful and dominant, used sometimes as an instrument of oppression, must not tempt us into believing that it was thus in the mind and life of Jesus. There's a lot to think about there. One thing that's really been impressed about is in some of the readings, and now Pauline studies is not my main area of focus, but there's been movements of folks to remember that Jesus was Jewish, right? Because there have been deliberate moves, it seemed, to remove Jesus from Judaism. And what I find fascinating is this is back in the 40s. In this little book, Jesus and the Disinherited, somebody who's not on the big radar of American theologians is writing about the Jewishness of Jesus to establish that reality really significantly, and to make Jesus, to help us see Jesus as this Jew, this marginalized Jew, and in many ways is a helpful corrective to some of the other kinds of ideas that were out there. Yet many people, of course, wouldn't have read Howard Thurman. But my second point is really a question. So my first point is to say that the diaspora Christians or the disinherited possess this unique perspective and a unique power to demonstrate the way of Christ. But then you might ask, well, what is a diaspora Christian? And this is where some of my work in 1 Peter comes in. You know, when I used to subscribe to Christianity Today, and I've told folks this at Christianity Today because they had me during the lockdown portion of the pandemic. I got a chance to talk to some of their staff, and we actually talked about this book, Might from the Margins, and so I told this story. I'm not sure everybody was happy with it, but it was that one of the things I used to see in the book, in the magazine, and again, I'm not trying to throw stones, I'm just trying to paint a picture here, is that much of the Christianity in America at that time, so 80s, 90s, right, was focused on certain big white churches in America. I mean, that was the status of evangelicalism. But there were ads in there that I thought were interesting, and the ads were to find your family crest. Now, there's folks here from the United Kingdom. I have a last name, Edwards. I have absolutely no idea how I have this name, right? Now, I'm sure there's an Edwards crest, but what it said to me more so was, we know our audience, and we know the kind of folks that are going to pay attention to these kinds of ads. Basically, not you, Dennis, because I'm part of a diaspora. I'm part of people whose people came here for a variety of reasons, or came to the U.S., under conditions that, well, to put it bluntly, were painful and horrendous. Right? But my point is, diaspora we can define in a whole bunch of ways, but for African Americans, we are a diaspora people. I would say for your black population up here in Canada, diaspora people. So we take this title back in the States, we call ourselves African Americans because we don't know where we came from. So we name the whole continent. The people who first received the New Testament letter called 1 Peter were marginalized believers and I'm going to make this connection to the diaspora of my people to 1 Peter. So right in the opening, he says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion, there's our word there, diaspora, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and to be sprinkled with his blood. May grace and peace be yours in abundance. Later on, then in chapter 2, he'll use similar language. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles, that kind of, some folks would translate resident alien, to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. He is actually encouraging his people to embrace this identity of foreigner, exile, alien, stranger. Now, there's no shortage of studies around, no shortage of studies around those terms that I just brought up. And Dr. Kovalisha could tell you, because she's done work in this part of the Bible too. I mean, the terms that he uses, elect, we get that. But parapidemos, paroikia, these terms we translate like alien, foreigner, exile. I mean, all the commentaries will discuss these terms and how we should understand them. Are they literal? Are they metaphorical? And one scholar kind of concludes this. He says, the figures, jumped the gun, sorry. The figures are, they are figures of speech, metaphors by which a situation of social alienness is characterized. So this is pretty much where many scholars are landing. We're not talking about people who necessarily were physically removed geographically, but they are still alienated. So the experience of somebody who is physically moved from one place to another mirrors that of the audience in 1 Peter, just to put it simply. Shively Smith, she's written, by now it should be clear that in 1 Peter the notion of diaspora is central to properly understanding the letter's purpose and impact. Diverging from more traditional Hellenistic scriptural notions concerning diaspora, 1 Peter does not define it as a geographic dislocation from physical and human place of origin. So many scholars are seeing this as a metaphorical term. But even so, even if geographic displacement isn't the issue, the point is that diaspora is an apt description of the conditions of these people. They are out of place in the world. Smith will go on to say, this letter, 1 Peter, considers suffering as an unavoidable feature of diaspora life, and that's the point I'm really trying to drive home, because diaspora means being out of place. It means alienation. It means vulnerability. Betsy Bauman Martin, she writes how vulnerable Peter's people were under the Roman Empire. She goes, 1 Peter was written in a time of and for an audience that experienced imperialism, an ideology that upholds the legitimacy of the economic and military control of one country by another, and colonialism, a practice which results from imperialism, specifically the settlement of groups from the more dominant country in the country of the conquered, often for means of control. Asia Minor, the site of the audience for 1 Peter, had experienced imperialism since the time of Alexander the Great, and colonialism in the form of taxation and new religious demands, extraction of resources, including human ones, less autonomy for governors, and overall imperial supervision. So she's given us a little bit of the geopolitical landscape, but telling us, what colonialism and imperialism looked like for Peter's audience. And then, because I like this quote, it's so beautiful, it's from a theologian, not a biblical person per se, but Willie James Jennings wrote this beautiful description of what diaspora can mean. It's kind of long, so I don't know if I want to read it all. It's just that it's so beautiful. He's such a good writer, so I'm going to do it. Diaspora means scattering and fragmentation, exile and loss. It means being displaced and in search of a place that could be made home. Danger and threats surround diaspora life. Diaspora life is crowded with self-questioning and questions for God concerning the anger, hatred, and violence visited upon a people. We must never confuse voluntary migration with diaspora, because diaspora is a geographic and social world not chosen, a psychic state inescapable. The peoples who inhabit diaspora live with animus and violence filling the air they breathe. They live always on the verge of being classified enemy, always in evaluation of their productivity to the empire, always having an acceptance on loan, ready to be taken away at the first sign of sedition. They live with fear as an ever-present partner in their lives, the fear of being turned into a them, a dangerous other, those people among us. They also remember loss of land and place, of life and hope, and even for some, of faith. Yet, diaspora is also power. The power of a conviction to survive, and the power of a confession to never yield to the forces that would destroy them. Diaspora is life by any means necessary. The condition of diaspora is often bound up with life under empire. Faith is always caught between diaspora and empire. It is always caught between those on the one side focused on survival and fixated on securing a future for their people, and on the other side, those intoxicated with the power and possibilities of empire and of building a world ordered by its financial, social, and political logics that claim to be the best possible way to bring stability and lasting peace. Whew. I mean, there's a lot in there. And we could spend like a whole night just discussing that big paragraph. But I think you're getting it. The sense of alienation But the paradox is in that alienation, there's a power. And Jennings points that out. So diaspora can signify shame. It's a place of alienation. Diaspora people have little social status. But I'll press on to make another point, that diaspora Christians are those who practice their faith as marginalized people. They are the vulnerable in society who hold on to Jesus. They are those who, because of race, ethnicity, language, sex, gender, physical appearance, or capability, income, a host of other reasons, are pushed to the side. Yet in their vulnerability, their pain, and even shame, they show us the way of Jesus. This is the paradox. So my next point is that through their suffering, diaspora Christians show us the way of Jesus. Through their suffering, they show us the way of Jesus. Consider the words that Peter addresses to the lowest of the low in chapter 2 of his letter. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but those also who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. I told the class that when I was working on that pastoral commentary on 1 Peter, that this was the hardest section for me. The descent to the dead, that's confusing grammar and like what in the world's going on there, but it didn't feel like it was bothering my life so much, you know. I mean, we just had to kind of work that out and figure that out. But this passage was bothering me. I mean, what I mean is that Peter not only fails to denounce slavery, he goes so far as to tell enslaved people to defer to their masters, even if the masters are harsh. I mean, enslaved people had minimal social status in ancient Rome, being defined as chattel who, lacking citizenship, lacked the essential qualification of humanity. That's a quote from Ochtemeyer. But in 1 Peter 2:18, part of what I'm giving you here, the author addresses household slaves with the command to submit to their masters in all fear. The same attitude that the entire community should have toward God, which he mentions in other places. That attitude has to be evident among enslaved people toward their masters. So godly enslaved people need to submit to their masters no matter how kind or harsh. This is pointed out in the letter. This dimension of 1 Peter's command is especially difficult for my 21st century ears to hear. I will say this, however, that 1 Peter doesn't give validation to the harsh treatment by slave masters. In fact, in 2:19, he makes it explicit that suffering is unjust. I appreciate that he goes as far as to call it unjust. 1 Peter's advocacy of non-retaliatory behavior is not an endorsement of slavery. It's also not an indication of the weakness of slaves. Peaceful submission to even the harshest of masters is evidence, he's arguing, of genuine Christian faith. The point is to grasp what Christ-like behavior looks like in one of the most difficult situations imaginable. Enslaved people, though in this horrible, unenviable position, have the peculiar honor of serving as living examples of what Jesus is like. The enslaved model what is important to God. I want to make that point clear, that we're talking about the lowest of the low modeling what godly behavior is. The early Christians, especially the enslaved, were not in the position to overturn Rome's oppressive and hierarchical social structure. And there's a lot of reasons that we could come up with. There's some Bible scholars in this room who could probably have a big conversation about what we do with these kinds of household codes in the New Testament. I'm not going to spend the night doing that. But I want you to wrestle with something, and one of the things I want you to wrestle with is how these folks in the most marginalized position are held up as models. Miroslav Volf, he says, the call to follow the crucified Messiah was, in the long run, much more effective in changing the unjust political, economic, and familial structures than direct exhortations to revolutionize them would have been. For an allegiance to the crucified Messiah, indeed, worship of a crucified God, is an eminently political act that subverts a politics of dominion at its core. And then Volf goes on to say, what should we learn from the text? This verse, he said, what we should learn is not, of course, to keep our mouths shut and hands folded, but to make our rhetoric and action more modest so that they can be effective. As we strive for social change, 1 Peter nudges us to drop the pen that scripts master narratives and instead give account of the living hope in God and God's future. To abandon the project of reshaping society from the ground up and instead do as much as we can from where we are at the time we are there. To suffer injustice and bless the unjust rather than perpetrating violence by repaying evil for evil or abuse for abuse. To replace the anger of frustration with the joy of expectation. Now, there's some things in there that I really like. There's some things that are challenging for me because I think his admonitions find a much easier reception among the dominant culture because it sounds like you can really take a long time and wait things out. For some of us, that's a really hard call, right? But even as a person of color, I'm finding a measure of hope that allegiance to Christ can be a subversive act within a culture that depends upon violence and intimidation in order to maintain social order. So as I noted, these enslaved people did not have the ability at this point to overturn any injustice in society, and Peter at least calls their treatment unjust. So what he does is give his people a strategy for survival. It's like driving while black. Many of us teach our children to be extra cautious with law enforcement because even if you are in the right, any sign of disrespect could be their excuse for things to escalate. Young Americans, being diaspora people, live in a tension where conformity is pitted against resistance and where the stakes can be life or death. Suffering, as I said, is characteristic of diaspora life, but diaspora Christians give us this picture of Jesus that's more accurate than the blonde, blue-eyed European Jesus whose picture hangs in so many churches. Diaspora Christians show us a Jesus who suffered, but not for nothing. Jesus who suffered but did not retaliate serves as the ultimate example for Peter's readers, at least not retaliation in a violent way. Peter quotes from Isaiah. I'm not going to reread the whole passage there, but I just highlighted some places where he's building on the suffering servant image in Isaiah. And according to Richard Balcom, New Testament scholar, early Christians interpreted the person and mission of Jesus through the lens of Isaiah 40 to 66, equating the servant of the Lord with Jesus. The suffering of Jesus is testimony of God's sovereignty, and the suffering of the followers of Jesus is testimony of their allegiance to Christ. And that phrase right there at the start of verse 21, for to this you have been called, points back actually even to the abuse described in verse 20, indicates that suffering is not meaningless. It serves some kind of purpose, and the purpose is found when considering the suffering of Christ. So what Christ went through on earth was for others, even these enslaved people, and provides an example for encouragement and motivation. So these verses, chapter 2, 21 through 25, focus on this catalytic impact that suffering can have. That is, in the way that Christ serves as an example for Christian slaves because he endured unjust treatment, the attitude of these enslaved people during the heat of oppression becomes now a witness to their contemporary onlookers. Enslaved people are following in the footsteps of Christ, and people are to follow in their footsteps. So for us, or for me, in the U.S., the civil rights movement illustrates Peter's point of how God's diaspora people witness to the world even through suffering. And one of the things that made the civil rights movement at least somewhat effective, we can argue about that, was the way innocent protesters endured abuse. They retained their dignity and did not retaliate with violence. And although there were some who disagreed with that nonviolent approach, many look back on history and note that that philosophy, which was at the heart of much of the movement, drove through at least some legislative changes that inched their way through the government. The late John Lewis, he describes the effect it had on so-called Bloody Sunday. I won't take the time to read from his memoir, but I do have a quote from his memoir. But the point he's saying, after we got beat up on Bloody Sunday and it got broadcast on national TV, the president had to do something. So not only are we to laud and celebrate the Christians who first read 1 Peter, we're to see them as our teachers. And by extension, we still find teachers among those who are dishonored in society because of their diaspora status, despite their marginal status. No, I'm arguing because of their marginal status, diaspora Christians embody the values and virtues of Jesus in a way that the dominant culture might not understand or even respect. The USA's history is full of stories of immigrants, slaves, women whose faith not only sustained them through suffering, but served to be a testimony to others. That is really the heart of what I'm trying to get at. Where are we looking for our examples of what Christ-likeness is? Because my own mother died at a relatively young age, my main link to her family came through my great aunt. Her name is Flossie. And I became close to Aunt Flossie during my, almost 18 years we were in Washington, D.C. She had come up during the Great Migration from South Carolina up to D.C. with her older sister, my grandmother. And they started to raise their children there. If you're not familiar with the Great Migration, we were just talking about this book tonight at dinner, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. It's a beautiful, one of the best books I've ever read, well, had read to me as audible. And my family certainly participated in that. The Great Migration happened largely due to the domestic terrorism from hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan directed toward African Americans. So life in the North held the promise of better opportunity and safety. So now this is years ago. The book, the novel, The Help came out, and then the movie came out. And I remember talking to my great aunt during that time, and I said, are you going to see that movie? Because she had done domestic work for years. And she said, Dennis, why would I want to see that movie? Her own grandkids were trying to get her to see the movie. And this is a quote from her. She says, Dennis, don't you know all the females, that's her word, don't you know all the females in your family did domestic work for white people? I mean, that's a long history. And I'll never know or appreciate the mess that these women had to face. The verbal abuse they took, the segregation they endured, the humiliation of having to clean up other people's mess, the thankless task of cooking other people's meals, caring for other people's children, then on top of that, having to cook, clean, and care for their own families. And what a burden these women carried for years upon years. Yet there are so many of us who could say that with all the injustices that these women and some men had to endure, there's this legacy of faith. So a few years ago, several now, I attended and participated in Aunt Flossie's funeral. She died in her 90s. And the eulogist was a retired federal judge, having been one of the few African Americans in that role. My Aunt Flossie was one of the first people to hold him after he was born. He grew up across the street from her. And the eulogy acknowledged her difficult life journey, including picking cotton and such. The judge emphasized her virtuous character. And he said something just kind of almost in passing, how she lived the golden rule, and the whole place was just moved with a response there because they all knew this was true. So here she is, living this humble, godly life in arguably the most powerful city in the world, Washington, D.C., demonstrating a faith more tenacious, a love more generous than many professing Christians with power and status. And I lived and worked in D.C., and people fall all over themselves trying to get near the White House and near those important offices and get a photo op with a president and try to get near the power. And will somehow connect that kind of pursuit of that power with their faith. Yet the people they pass along the way, who are serving them food, who are working the elevators, who are cleaning the floors, who've been in D.C. for generations, whose faith is deep and tenacious, they don't even see. Christians have been taught, obviously as well as subtly, that only the powerful in society have the ability to teach anything of substance. The lessons from the marginalized are only for other marginalized people. But the scriptures and experience demonstrate is that oppressed and marginalized people are our most powerful teachers of what it means to follow Jesus, if we are ready and willing to listen. Diaspora Christians are not merely inspirational, they are educational. They are our teachers. And the church does well to follow the lead of those on the margins, because it's there that we often see Christ most clearly. So perhaps the best teachers for Christians are not to be found exclusively among the powerful in society, but largely among those diaspora, marginalized, displaced Christians whose association to the state has been questioned and scrutinized because of their lowly position in society. Yet, because of their great faith, they have a power that we ought to respect and reckon with. Thank you.
That was brilliant. We now have a good bit of time for Q&A. And so, as I mentioned, there's a microphone in the back if you're way over here and don't want to. Oh, there's a microphone on either side. Perfect. And again, if you are online, please do send in questions to questions@regent-college.edu. But I will let Dennis moderate as there are questions.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for your message and with sharing with us. I'm from Sydney, Australia, so obviously the US context, we see the US as being a very Christian country. And
I'm sorry, you said you see the US as a very Christian country?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Much more so than Australia and many other nations, but anyway. But my question really is, how do we avoid bias in our reading of Scripture? And possibly even in our reading through theology as well. I have a friend who made me think when he said that, when he reads theology books, he tries to make sure that he's not reading one written by a white author all the time, that reading from different nations, like every third one he reads, he tries to read from different countries. So I guess what advice can you give us as to ways that we can avoid bias in the way that we approach Scripture?
Thank you for the question. And I don't think we can avoid bias. I think we all come with biases. We come with our lenses, our perspectives, as the scholars call it, our social locations. And that's why I think one of the most important things we can do, and maybe this is counter to the way some Americans were taught to read Scripture, is to read it in communities and to read it with other people. We tend to have made our Scripture study a very personal exercise and private even, I think there's value in the multitude of voices wrestling with ideas. The Anabaptists will talk about hermeneutical communities, folks who come together to help discern what the Scriptures are saying. So I don't think we can avoid the bias. But what I think we can do is, and this is spilling over into the other book I wrote, which sounds so weird for this little kid from Queens to be saying, the other book I wrote. I sometimes can't imagine that. But I wrote a book about humility. And that's part of what I was trying to argue, is that, I'll come with a bias, but so will you, and we'll come together and we'll do some good engagement, and even maybe the metaphor of wrestling fits well. We'll wrestle with some things, So, but part of what I think is also happening is that we are, and this, I have seen this somewhat be intimidating to some white folks in America, is because more of us who are not white are getting educated in the same formal ways and bringing our voices into these spaces. It's starting to be viewed as threatening. and that we're somehow changing their Bible or changing things when we are bringing our lens and our perspective. So when I passed my oral defense for my doctorate, I tell these stories about Dr. Fitzmyer because I thought he was such a New Testament giant, and I studied under him at Catholic University. And he was hard, even in the oral defense, which I thought was not going to go so hard. But anyway, at the end of it all, the dean walks in and says, congratulates you, and it's a very emotional moment. And he says, you're our first African-American graduate in the PhD program. And I thought, first? Are we still at that place, right? First? But it helped me to understand that there was a reason why I wasn't hearing so much, because there weren't people teaching me that came from my world and understanding, right? So what could feel like a bias that's negative, right? I mean, it's something that's like messing me up and shaking my world and stuff, and maybe it actually does do that, is because somebody's eyes are on a text that are different from mine. So I would encourage us kind of, maybe because we have to swing the pendulum a little bit, is to respect the voices of those who are coming from parts of the Christian experience that hadn't enjoyed that power status in the world. So that's a long answer, but I think you're catching what I'm trying to say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edwards. That was really good.
Thank you.
As you were speaking, I was thinking, I really appreciated how much you were bringing from your American context and the margins of the American context. I just want to say, as a Canadian, someone who's born in Canada, how much of that resonated with my experience of thinking of Canadian history. It's very easy as a Canadian to always look at America as this terrible place where all this injustice happened. But as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about especially the slide about the colonial Roman Empire and its resource management. And it's of course very easy to think of Indigenous Canadians. It's easy to think of how Vancouver treated the Japanese during World War II. It's easy to think of those who are marginalized today, maybe LGBTQ people who are just different and face that. But I want to ask you what. It's easy as a young guy to go, yeah, we're going to buck this. We're going to find ways to listen to the marginalized. But then you get into positions of power. Even a position of power like a pastor, not look like a lot of power, but it still is power. So I just wonder what your advice is to those of us who are going to enter those places of small marginal power, but power nonetheless, of how to cultivate, how to resist that, and how to cultivate that listening to the margins.
Wow, I respect a lot of that so much, Daniel. I appreciate it. It's kind of funny to hear you talk about the evil empire of the U.S. in some ways, and then to hear our brother from Australia say, "This is a Christian nation." I'm like, that's our problem right there, right in the nutshell. But I like the word "cultivate" that you used because okay, so I'm getting up there in years. I'm remembering in the '90s how Promise Keepers was this big thing that was taken off, at least in the States, right? And they were going to get everybody together in a stadium, and men were going to make promises, and then they were going to hug each other and presumably go home and hug their wives. And there was a racial element put in there that so there was like confession of sin, and then you're hugging somebody who's different from yourself. Of course, there's a handful of black people in these big stadiums, so all the white guys clamoring to hug this black. And a friend of mine was in one of those events, and he stopped the guy, wouldn't let him hug him. He said, "Look," he said, "you're going to hug me in the stadium and you never see me again." He said, "Go home and find that African-American pastor down the street, and you build a relationship with that person," right? There's something about finding what community looks like and means in a broader sense than what maybe we have. At least that's the way I've been feeling. And I would say the humility part that comes into that is, young sister, we were talking today about this, is that sometimes people would think of ministry to diaspora people as just that. It's something I'm going to do to or for them, not a posture of how am I going to learn from these folks who have been practicing their faith in situations and conditions so different from mine. So the humility part is I would ask pastors and other leaders to find those ways that they can submit to the learning, to the teaching of folks who don't share that background. So that's sort of a pragmatic answer, but of course it also includes what our brother was saying earlier about reading works from people who don't come from your same place. And there's a New Testament commentary that's out that Dr. Miriam knows that IVP just put out called the New Testament in Color, that we were trying to put together a collection of scholars from various social locations to make commentary on different parts of the New Testament. So I have a entry in there, Colossians, Philemon, but there's Native American scholars and Asian American, African American, different folks in there. So you get, at least it's a taste of different voices, to see how they're treating biblical texts. So that's another place. So your reading and your experience, I guess. Yes?
Yeah, I was trying to visualize what you said about the marginalized having something to teach the powerful. And sort of what came to my mind was the homeless addict and the police officer. And I was thinking, is the police officer less addicted to his uniform and self-image than the addict is to the drug? Because and the other thing is, the police officer seems to think himself as a very hard-working person. But from what I've observed, it takes a lot of hard work to survive when you're homeless. Just thoughts.
Well, no, I do appreciate your thoughts. I'll give a very personal answer here, is that I'm very reluctant to to imagine that I know somebody's sort of way of being, even though I might see something they project to me, you know what I mean? But I used to, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't know really how that police officer is negotiating their space and time, or that homeless person. What I used to think was that I did know, and I almost always projected something that I was thinking or feeling myself, at the time. And I've learned over the years that I don't have to do that. I can investigate. I can find out, right? I can ask. And so part of what I've learned as a pastor over the years is I want to know, like, what you're feeling and thinking. Now, not everybody's willing to share that, and some people are certainly guarded about it. So I don't know what the police officer's feeling. I don't know what that homeless person's feeling and thinking. But if I'm truly want to live my faith in a very relevant way, then I want to find out, right? I mean, I want to be that peacemaker. I want to be the person who's helping them to see that Christ offers us a better way than polarized, alienated kind of behaviors, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't know what they're finding their power and identity in. And I could imagine it being something that's unhealthy. But part of my job is to help them see a better way, I think. I know that sounds kind of naive and idealistic, but that's part of the way I'm reading 1 Peter, you peculiar people. Peculiar is not odd. Well, it could be. But it could also be intriguing. It could be, imaginative. There could be other ways to be peculiar people, I guess, That was more than you said, but it got me on a roll. Yes, Stephen?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how, and because I grew up with this for sure in a church that was multi-ethnic but culturally rather white. The spiritualizing, for lack of a better term, of exile, that Christians live in exile in society. And it kind of made sense, but it also kind of seemed to ring a little hollow. I felt that sometimes people took it much too far. So I guess my question is, if I can boil this down to a question, is do you think that kind of spiritualizing, that metaphorizing of exile and diaspora, especially for non-marginalized Christians, is that entirely inappropriate? Or is it inappropriate in any way? And I'm not pushing back at all.
No, that's very intriguing, because I think about that a lot. Well, the metaphors work in different ways in different places, right? So for Hebrews, we've got this metaphor of folks where the world is not my home, right? Where I'm just passing through, kind of the way some of the old songs used to say. So the idea of exile is it's almost like Philippians, where Paul says, your citizenship is in heaven, right? This is not my home. Your identity is here. So much for the nationalism. Your citizenship is here, right? That's one way the exile metaphor might work, is that I have a home someplace else. For Peter, it seems like the exile metaphor isn't so much about this heavenly home notion, it's that people have pushed you away. They are, because of your faith and your new identity, they're pushing you away. So you're like pushed into this exile place. So at first I want to say that I think that there's different ways that metaphor is working in the New Testament. But more of your question is, how many of us are like in that 1 Peter situation, right? Where society has pushed us to the side and doesn't want to engage. Some of you are in cultures that it feels like that's happened already. I've been hearing terms like post-Christian or secular or words like that the church is basically irrelevant. You know, I don't travel as much as many of you, I mean, internationally, but I've been to places where, you know, there's big cathedrals and they're empty, you know, so they'll have concert in them or something because people aren't worshiping in there really. So there's this sense that maybe that exile, that there is an awareness that the church has been pushed into an exilic marginal space. And if that's true, the church as a whole, then where might we learn our lessons of how to navigate that from people who have been exiled and pushed aside and marginalized? So that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Doctor, I wanted to ask you, as a pastor, when we have in our congregations, local congregations, these beautiful marginalized people who have lots of life experience and lots of knowledge and lots of things to teach, but they will not be the ones who will be in front of an audience. They will not be holding a microphone. I wanted to ask you as a pastor, how do we make sure that the congregation benefits from that life knowledge they have and experience? Yeah,
that's a rather contextual kind of a question, but it's a beautiful one in my opinion, because you at least are recognizing as a pastor that there are these multifaceted experiences present in your congregation, and perhaps the challenge for you is creating spaces that allow for the interaction to take place that is less formal and less even threatening for somebody, because not everybody needs to stand up in front and be the sage on the stage, as they say. But there needs to be a space where we can share, which is one of the things I'm kind of delighted about that I'm seeing in some Christian circles is, I came up in a time when I felt it's called a ministry, where the models were always these big, huge mega things, right? And you had to have the best music and professional this and, all that stuff. And I'm seeing, my kids' generation, the millennials and maybe even younger, are like done with that, And for them, they want the table, they want fellowship, they want genuine kind of connection. Now, that's a general kind of a statement, but I see that. So I guess what I'm saying is there are ways, I think, to create spaces that are more about connection than they are about information, right? So, but I don't know what it's going to look like for your church. So I'm willing to say I don't know, because I honestly don't, and I don't have to manufacture an answer. But my point is that you can discover that together. And when I was serving a church in Minnesota, people were just coming and going. And I created these spaces for us to come together, and I said, we don't have to vote on anything. I said, it's just to come together. So we had meals. Sometimes we would toss out a question for people to kind of wrestle and think about, put people at tables to talk with people they hadn't known before. Sometimes it's hard for the introverts, but the idea was, let's find ways to be community and not just come together to sing and listen to the speaker on Sunday. Let's find some ways to connect. And food was also often that social lubricant, I think, that allowed for those things to happen. Yeah. But thank you.
Hi, Dr. Edwards. I wonder if you can speak to that tension of this beautiful concept of the strength our our trauma and our diaspora elements of weakness become our strength to point us to Christ, but not glorifying suffering and being like still lamenting it, especially people in diaspora, people holding, you hold incredible trauma with that, and yet it also becomes your strength to point you to Christ without, how do you hold lament and not make it something that it becomes glorified and still move towards redemption? And that.
Well, I confess how questions are often difficult for me because they are often contextual, but you've named the thing that has to happen, which I appreciate, and there's probably some other folks here could help with that answer. Because yes, both things need to happen, right? There's a healing, there's a lament. I like that you said that, and our Bible does that, right? It takes us to those places of deep sorrow, places of real recognition of pain. But it also takes us to places where we see the beauty that comes from that brokenness, right? So I don't know the how fully, but my answer would be yes. I want both of those things to be acknowledged. And the experts in the room who know about how to care for those who are still working out that trauma, I'll just say this. I'm glad that you acknowledged it because in many places we don't even acknowledge that people are dealing with that, right? So even if I tell you a story from my life and you say, oh, Dennis, you're old now, that's not the way it is anymore. But I'm carrying these things, right, that have been like seared into my life from painful places. I have certainly, yes, a healing work that's being done in my life, but at the same time, I think I have something to offer. So they happen simultaneously, I guess is what I'm saying. But I appreciate that you recognize that some healing work ought to happen, and there needs to be the space for people to lament the pain of being displaced, of being pushed to the margin, of being seen as less than when the faith that they have is vital and strong. And in fact, they have something to offer. So yes, I want both of those things happening at the same time. I don't always know the mechanism, but I do appreciate you naming that because, yeah, I don't want to glorify suffering, but at the same time, I want to say that those who've suffered have something to give us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Dr. Edwards.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, how do churches and institutions learn to adopt this posture of listening to the marginalized when they haven't operated this way in the past, and when doing so goes against vested interests?
Yeah, I've actually wrestled with that one a little bit. I mean, I was asked to speak in some other places, including my alma mater, where I did my first master's degree, Master of Divinity degree. And it was hard because I so much appreciated the invitation to get there, right? But then I was very emotional when I got there because I said, oh man, there were so many good things I got here, and there was a lot of hard things there for me too. And I don't mean hard from coursework, I mean hard culturally to fit into that space. And they used to have an ad, come study with the men who wrote the books. That was their thing back in, I guess it was in the 80s. And there were certainly men who had written the books. But it was almost this, kind of almost a bravado about where the experts come get from us. And some people certainly do have expertise in an area. But what I found is that there were some professors who, even with their expertise, were very eager to hear from their students and to learn about their context and how they wrestle with things. Not all of my professors were like that. I don't mean to say that, but there are some, and that's how I want it to be. I want it as a professor there's some things I've learned in school, and I want to feel like I have an expertise in certain things, but I also want to hear from you, and because your experience and your knowledge and what you've gained is valid, even though it might have to maybe grow here or work out here in some way, but it's needed. So I guess the answer to your question is, it's our posture as educators, what we're inviting into the room. And if we are intimidated to hear from others, or if we only have to hear our own voices. And I think that there's something about listening that we can model in the classroom. Yeah. Thanks.
Dr. Edwards, thank you so much.
Dr. Jim, thanks.
Can I ask an exegesis question?
Yeah, but I'm going to embarrass myself. I can't answer. New Testament scholar, New Testament scholar, New Testament scholar. It's like, okay.
No. Well, I'm fascinated. So I've always been fascinated with 1 Peter's introduction.
Okay.
And I'm wondering. So 1 Peter has this remarkable theme, something more central than theme, about exile.
Mm-hmm.
And those who experience marginalization and exile, reflecting, I don't know if that's the right word, reflecting Jesus, becoming a model for Jesus. There's this very close relationship between Christ and their identity.
Yeah.
And I've always been fascinated with the sprinkling with his blood.
Oh, okay.
And I'm wondering, is in this, to those who are the elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, and so forth, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father and the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood. And I'm wondering, is that imagery setting something up? Is there an insight from the marginalization theme is there a connection there? And the answer might be no, which is fine. But
well, you're going to put me on the spot a little bit. It's an Exodus image, I think. It's Moses. There's Moses sprinkling the blood. So what do we see in these images? Cleansing. We see sanctification, blessing. So I think it's a throwback to that, right, image. But I guess if I were to make the connection that you're asking, is like, how might this be for the community? I see a very Trinitarian thing happening there in the opening verses, right? There's a foreknowledge of God, the sanctification of the Spirit, obedience to Jesus Christ, all mentioned like in that one verse. The sprinkling of his blood, I do see that as sort of a consecrating kind of an act, right? But now you make me want to go back and read some more, but that would be my first thought there. It's an Exodus image. But I'm going to call on my other New Testament colleagues. Anybody want to add something to that? And Dr. Isaac up there, I see Miriam. Okay, all right. I'll stay with that, Father Jim. Yeah, thank you. But now you got me thinking, because the way that verse sets up the rest of the letter, I think is important. One of the things we said in class this week is, for a beleaguered community, one of the things that you can do is to establish their identity, right? And he does that right away. You have a new birth. You're in this family. God's the parent. It's not the feudal way of your ancestors, but he uses new birth imagery several times. You're nursing on this logikos milk, this sincere milk. Even in the nursing act, you're finding this new identity. So there's an establishment of their, and he uses the word elect, right? So there's an establishment of their security with God, their blessing from God, despite what the world's doing to you, right? So I do think the sprinkling is part of that, right? It's part of this blessing and consecration of the people. So, yeah, but thank you.
Just one quick question.
Sure, I'll do my best. My answer's been long, but
I'm just curious for, say, folks who, are on the margins, and say they're at a school like ours, like this one, where they are, say, a racial or an ethnic minority, and they spend a lot of energy kind of helping people, helping those in the majority culture kind of find their way and learn about their experience. I'm just wondering if you have any words for people who find themselves in that situation. who are kind of exhausted from being a bridge for so long.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate you asking that. I was wrestling with that in the book, and some of the spaces in there. So I guess when I said this earlier in the evening, what I had hoped for partly in the book was a solidarity of the marginalized, that if we could come together in some way and help each other with our stories, that maybe there's a way that we communicate to the majority culture without it taxing, each of us or each of our groups in a way. Because, look, there are white brothers and sisters who simply want to learn and grow, right? It's not like the information's unavailable, but they want to learn and grow from us. But it does become rather tiring. And, we have to code switch, we have to figure out, in this context, is this a safe place for me to be myself? All the things that run through our minds and our hearts in there. So we do need places where we can come together and share that as a reality without it being judged or dismissed, right? We need that. But I think also coming together in a solidarity of the marginalized, we can encourage and reinvigorate each other to do what we can do. I'm not saying everybody has to own the same tasks. I have a lot I could say about this. I've written about it in places, but I guess the short answer is we can find some energy from each other and some, what's a good word, encouragement, I guess, from each other, and only take on what we can take on, because the task is really big. So I don't believe any one person needs to come off as, I'm the expert, I'm going to speak for all Asian people, come to me and I'll give you all the answers. I don't think we need to wear that mantle, right? But if we come together and share together, there are some spaces we can go into, and then there's a task somebody else can pick up. So it's a sharing, I guess is what I'm saying. But I will say this too. I wrote part of a chapter in there, in that book, that I call, every chapter says the power of something. I call the power of love. And typically when you get to the end of a book like this, the power of love is, well, we can all just get along. And that's not what I said. What I said in the power of love is one of the first things that we have to learn to love ourselves well. Because many of us who've been marginalized, that's not a lesson we've learned well, is how to love ourselves well. We learn to see ourselves through the eyes of the majority. So part of, for me personally, was to learn how to love myself well. And part of that means I won't enter into some of the spaces that people will pull me into, and try to get me to justify my existence. I'm just not going to do it because it's not a healthy thing for me. So I do have to balance that out, right, with a call to do ministry, but also a call that loving Dennis, a healthy Dennis, can't take on certain things. But thank you. That's a deeper conversation, and so I'm only touching the surface, but I really appreciate the question. Thank you.
I would love to continue conversing forever. I know, I'm going to just be a little bit moderator privilege here for a brief moment. I know you started your research in James, and you did your dissertation on James.
I did. Yay.
I am always pleased with it. But one thing that struck me when you were talking about diaspora Christians or those who practice their faith as marginalized Christians, or as marginalized people, is how that can model for us the opening of James, that you count your trials as blessings, because there's a knowledge piece that trials produce endurance.
Yeah.
And the need that people who are marginalized model this endurance, that you may become, and when you talked about your Aunt Flossie, I was hearing that you might become mature and complete, lacking in nothing. And the modeling that marginalized people can offer, assuming they grow in faith and they're seeking Christ and all these things, but there's a beauty to the scripturalness of this and the endurance that can be modeled, and how that leads to our completeness in Christ.
Wow, thank you. That's an edge that I hadn't fully thought through, but I'm actually working on an essay now where I'm looking at James and 1 Peter because of the diaspora language, and talking about how we respond to, maybe I shouldn't just say respond, but how we engage from that marginal position. And I really like that. I hadn't actually worked in those early verses in there. So thank you for that, because I'm already looking at you and Craig's commentary, so thank you.
Use it freely, it's yours. It came out of what you were saying.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
It's delightful. I deeply appreciate your scholarship. I deeply appreciate this book. Justo Gonzalez, in his Santa Biblia book, talks about how perspective is, if we're all looking at Scripture, but we stand in different points on the landscape. And I always feel, and I listen to you, that you help remove some of the trees that are blocking my view of Scripture.
Wow.
And I just, that's a big way, I think, of hearing a bit to some of the questions, too, is when we hear each other, we might remove some of the obstacles and we can see Scripture more profoundly. So thank all of you for being here and your questions, your engagement with this. Dennis, thank you for being here and doing this.
True pleasure. Thank you.
I've always appreciated the way you share your stories so freely with us. Much of what we do here at Regent is donor funded. So if you feel called, feel engaged, we do have a donations box in the back. Again, you can just put a card in there with your information for just hearing from us about other events that we have going on, but also feel free and give either physically here or online at rgnt.net/give. There we go. Those are confusing websites. But anyway, please just know that much of what we do is offered as ministry, and it is funded by people who are willing to give for it. Tonight's lecture will be available online soon at our YouTube channel, so feel free and follow up again if you want to rehear some of this. And these recordings will be available until the end of August. So again, we will be having a signing afterwards, so I'll be taking Dennis over to the bookstore, so feel free and come on over there. But again, thank you for being here, and again, one last thank you for Dennis for tonight.
Yeah.